In 1807, Great Britain banned the importation of slaves into British territories, and the dominant Royal Navy patrolled the coasts of Africa, intercepting slavers, slave ships, en route to the nations that still imported them, whether they were British or not. This cut into the American slave trade as well, reducing the number of people imported into the United States to labor in the fields and homes of the new country, especially the southern part of the USA. Most slave traders in America had known that their business is almost over. There was a growing and powerful abolition movement in the U.S. that in 1808 successfully pushed for a ban on the importation of slaves. Neither country banned slavery at this time, but they had just ended the forced kidnapping of Africans for the purpose of enslaving them. Slavery ended peacefully in Great Britain in 1833. It took a civil war for the U.S. to end the peculiar institution, the euphemism used by many Americans, especially in the South, for slavery. When the slave trade was banned, there were two ways for Southern slave owners to get more slaves: the illegal slave trade, which continued into the Civil War, and reproduction. Today, we're going to tell you about an aspect of slavery in America that's too often forgotten: the breeding of slaves. Thank you for supporting my channel with your likes. When I ask you like right now, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and press the bell. Thank you, bro. The black population in the U.S. before the Civil War. In 1810, the year the first census was taken after the law banning slave importation, there were just over 1.3 million black people in America. 1.19 million were slaves. 186,000 were free. In 1830, there were 2.32 million slaves and 319,000 free blacks. In 1861, the year before the Civil War began, there were 4.4 million slaves and just under 500,000 freemen, up 800,000 from the previous census in 1850. If the importation of slaves from Africa was banned, where did these enslaved people come from? Unless you're completely ignorant of human biology, you know, sexual relations. Except that many of the women held in bondage in the South had absolutely no choice in the matter. In addition to all of the other cruelties of slavery, the violence, the substandard and often horrible living conditions, and the simple fact that enslaved people by definition had no freedom. One of the worst, and perhaps the worst, was the sexual slavery that enslaved women were forced to endure, both to increase the labor force and to satisfy the sexual whims of their owners. And, as odd as it may seem, enslaved men were also victims of sexual violence, only in a different and sometimes more subtle way. Breeding farms. Though it has not been 100% proven by historians, many believe that books, legal testimony, word of mouth, biographies, letters, and documents from the post-slave trade and pre-Civil War 1800s all point to the existence of at least two places in the slave-owning South that were home to breeding farms, where black women were treated like domesticated animals and purposefully bred to increase the size of the herd of enslaved people. Even if these places, located in Richmond, Virginia, and the eastern shore of the Chesapeake Bay in Maryland, did not exist, it is a well-documented fact that women in the slave-owning South were forcibly bred or encouraged to have children, the encouragement being a bit of an easier life for a time, or back to heavy labor in the fields or elsewhere on the plantation. The terms used for these women and about these women were no different than those used to refer to the breeding stock of cattle, sheep, and goats. Breeding stock was actually the preferred term for women and girls who had a history of childbearing, or women and girls who were, at least on the outside, built for it, with wide hips and larger breasts. Whether at the breeding farms, which were thought to have been set up by the biggest slave traders in the country to continue making a profit after the importation of people from Africa was made illegal, or on the plantations and farms, large and small, forced reproduction through sexual assault was common. As farmers and ranchers do with their cattle, slave owners kept detailed records of which women got pregnant by which man. That is, if the man was also a slave. More about the exceptions to that in a moment. These records had to be kept to avoid inbreeding or forcing women to submit who could not have children, not out of sympathy for the woman, but because of the bottom line: profits and time. To ensure pregnancy, women were often subject to many assaults, sometimes by the same man, sometimes by many men. Of course, any sexual contact that is not a choice is an assault. But to paint an accurate picture, sometimes the attempts at reproduction were not overtly violent, but sometimes they were. On many occasions, intercourse between an enslaved man and an enslaved woman was observed by their owners, overseers, or both. Only imagine that some sick minds observed these encounters regularly. Now about the men. Healthy, muscular, well-built men were the primary breeding stock used to impregnate female slaves. These men were sometimes rewarded with the chance to be with a woman. But more often, they were ordered to do so, repeatedly until a woman or sexually mature girl became pregnant. Many times, these men were ordered to perform, not doing so or not being able to do so, considering there was often an audience to the act, and the women and girls might have been terrified and known to them, might result in punishment or an increased workload. Doctors and their experiments. While it may seem paradoxical for doctors who are supposed to be healers to oversee the breeding of enslaved people, this was a common practice on many plantations during the period before war. Plantation owners would hire doctors to ensure that enslaved women were healthy enough to breed and to treat any medical issues that arose during the breeding process. The most famous example of this was Dr. J. Marion Sims, who is often referred to as the father of modern gynecology. Sims performed a number of experimental surgeries on enslaved women in the mid-1800s, including surgeries to repair fistulas, a condition that often occurred during childbirth. Sims conducted these surgeries without anesthesia, as he believed that enslaved people did not feel pain in the same way as white people. His work on fistulas led to the development of new surgical techniques, but it came at a great cost to the enslaved women who were subjected to his experiments. In addition to performing surgeries, doctors were also responsible for ensuring that enslaved women were healthy enough to produce offspring. This often involved monitoring their diets and treating any illnesses that could affect their ability to conceive. However, it's important to note that this care was not provided out of concern for the well-being of the enslaved people, but rather to ensure that they were able to produce more slaves for the plantation owner's profit. Partus sequitur ventrum. It is a Latin phrase adapted into law in the pre-Civil War USA. It means, that which is born follows the womb. In plain English, a child follows the mother. It's an important concept because it means that a child born of a white man and a black woman was always considered black and a slave. Of course, there were exceptions, but in addition to black men being forced to breed black women, many white owners and their overseers had children by enslaved women. Black women were often the first sexual contact that Southern white males had, because it meant nothing, at least not to slave owners. In 2020, American author, poet, and chef Caroline Randall Williams wrote an op-ed for the NY Times called, "You Want a Confederate Monument? My Body is a Confederate Monument." In it, she wrote, "I have rape-colored skin. My light brown blackness is a living testament to the rules, the practices, the causes of the Old South. If there are those who want to remember the legacy of the Confederacy, if they want monuments, well then, my body is a monument. My skin is a monument." I hope you enjoy my videos. Please press like button and subscribe to the channel. Thanks for watching, bro.